Good evening, I'm Gotti Schwartz coming to you from Los Angeles, and here's some of the stories we're following tonight. Words like historic and once in a generation are being used to describe the winter storm making its way across much of the country right now. So how prepared should you be? With winter storm warnings from the Midwest to blizzard warnings in the mountains of Los Angeles, we're tracking all of it. Meanwhile, breaking news out of Florida where several people have been shot, including a news crew out covering another murder. We're going to have the latest in just a moment. Plus, President Biden wraps up a historic trip on the world stage, but not before Russia raises tensions by firing off a ballistic missile. Former President Donald Trump makes a trip to Ohio, still reeling from that toxic train derailment. But the story continues to be about the health of the people who live there.
Tons of headaches, just all kinds of negatives, man. Don't feel good.
And the astonishing moment when an Alaskan state representative argues that child abuse could be a good thing for society.
You know, in the case where child abuse is fatal, obviously it's not good for the child, but it's actually a benefit to society.
An absolutely massive winter storm is barreling across the country right now with lots and lots of snow in parts of California to the Great Plains to the Midwest all the way to New England. All in all, nearly 60 million people are dealing with some kind of winter advisory. State leaders are telling people to stay home and stay off the roads, and that's because snow-covered roads can be extremely unpredictable. Look at this incredible video of a Wyoming highway police officer just barely getting out of the way as that semi slid off the road. Airports like this one that you see right now in South Dakota, they are closing during this storm. Over 1,400 flights have been canceled. And in Minnesota, the governor even activated the National Guard to help. NBC News national correspondent Gabe Gutierrez joins us now. Gabe, does Minnesota usually lean on the National Guard during these huge winter storms?
Hey there, Gotti. Well, not usually. This is a major winter storm, and as you may know, this is an area of the country that is used to this wicked weather. But the governor says this is just in standby mode, essentially coordinating with the state patrol to have resources standing by in case things get really nasty overnight. Now, again, where the National Weather Service is saying that travel will be nearly impossible throughout much of Minnesota into tomorrow morning, Gotti.
It looks like right behind you, there are people shoveling, and you got a little person helping out her big person as they're shoveling the sidewalks. How bad have things gotten so far? This is a lot of the prep before the big storm, right?
Yeah, that's right, Gotti. Yes, and a family, we're here in the neighborhood, a little one helping out. The temperatures have dropped, a little bit where the wind is starting to pick up. But this is the second wave of snow that is just beginning, again, expected to continue throughout tomorrow morning. Neighborhoods like this, will be calm. People are going to be hunkering down overnight. And, yeah, they're expected to get quite a bit of snow overnight, and people are being urged to stay off the roads. But, these hardy folks here in Minnesota are out shoveling snow even well into the night, Gotti.
I don't know whose idea it was to put that temperature right above you. It says 16 degrees. I'm so sorry, man. I got to ask, how are you keeping warm? Or do you have an electric
and that's without wind chill. If you count
socks?
the wind chill, we're in the single digits.
Oh, my God. What's the secret? Tell us. You've seen your fair share of standing out there in 16 or single-digit degrees. How are you keeping warm?
Well, you know what, God, it's funny you asked that question. I'm not sure if it was you or perhaps one of the producers you were working with, but a couple of years ago, one of you recommended to me a heated vest, and I will have you know, Gotti, this is the first trip that I'm breaking it in. I actually am wearing a heated vest underneath this coat. Layering is key, of course. I'm a big fan of the double socks. You need the gloves, the hat. Although the photojournalist I'm working with, Mark, he is from Minnesota, and he's barely wearing snow boots, if at all, like
shorts.
jeans, and no scarf. He's really putting me to shame here. But, me being from Miami, I really need to be decked out head to toe.
Yep. You got that little Iron Man action where you just press the button and then it heats you right up. That's awesome.
Gotti,
thanks so
you've been out here.
And just about everyone in the country is going to be dealing with some sort of notable weather, whether that's winter storm that you just saw or record-breaking heat. NBC News' correspondent Sam Brox has a look at what people are experiencing in Florida. Take a look.
Orlando, for example, is expected to hit 90 degrees today. It's February 22nd, and it's 90 in Orlando. So if that happens, it will be the first time in February that Orlando has seen those temperatures since 1962.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Brock. Put some shoes on now. Here's how drastic this temperature split is. In Sioux Falls, South Dakota, it feels like -10. There in South Florida, it feels over 90 degrees warmer. Let's bring in just the person we need to break all of this down. NBC News meteorologist Bill Cairns. Bill, did you see Sam there?
I did. I mean, I was booing him earlier today when I saw him doing it. I've never booed an NBC News correspondent before, but I was like, come on. He had the smeared sunglasses on. Like, the only thing he was missing was a cocktail.
Exactly.
Exactly. So let's get into some of these, the wild weather that's going on across the country. There's still some dangerous weather conditions out there. I've got good news for some people, and other people, you still have the worst to go through. So all afternoon, eyes were on two things. One was the tornado watch near the St. Louis area. Thankfully, we made it through there. I didn't hear any reports of any tornadoes or any damage or anything, so that's great. That threat over with these storms rolling through Kentucky. The worst of it, I think, has been areas of southern Michigan and right along the Illinois-Wisconsin border. We've had freezing rain for like the last 6 hours. There's the kind of freezing rain where the mailboxes are just encased. All the tree limbs have about, they all look like in the lights, they're all glossy and sparkling. You have about a 1/4 inch of ice. Power outages haven't really piled up too badly yet, but we'll see how much longer this continues through the night. So here's kind of the timing throughout the overnight. So I paused this at 8 a.m. tomorrow morning. Anywhere in blue shows you where the snow is. So still on and off snow from Minneapolis to Duluth over towards Green Bay. Minneapolis, by the way, at this time yesterday, we were thinking maybe 18 to 20 inches of snow. That has been lowered significantly. They're probably going to end up with somewhere between 8 to 12 inches. So, good news for them. They're not going to have this historic crippling storm. Still a major snowstorm, but not like how it looked yesterday. And then northern New England's going to get the snow. And then it looks like a little break during the evening. And then tomorrow night in the evening hours after sunset, another batch of snow comes through the northeast. So what does all this mean? Additional freezing rain. Detroit to Grand Rapids, that's the area where we already have the freezing rain, so that could have caused some problems. And then there's still going to be a light wintry mix of sleet and freezing rain in areas of central New England. So in all, when we take our colorful map here and show you everyone under blizzard warnings, winter storm warnings, winter weather advisories, that's 70 million people. And yes, this is blizzard warnings 10 miles outside of Los Angeles. We're especially watching out. I'm sure everyone's talking about it in California. These snow levels are going to be so low that they say everyone in any major city in California will be able to see snow by the time we get to Saturday morning.
I will believe it when I see it.
I know.
NBC's Bill Cairns. Thanks so much. And we've got some breaking news out of Florida tonight. Police say 3 people are dead after a series of shootings at the same place earlier today. It all started this morning when investigators say a 19-year-old gunman allegedly shot and killed a woman in Pine Hills. Later, as news crews showed up to cover that tragedy, a gunman walked up to the news van and opened fire. 2 reporters covering the scene were also shot. Other reporters rushed in to help them. Police say it all happened by the same shooter. Later, the shooter allegedly shot a mother and her 9-year-old daughter on that same street. Right now, the mom is in critical condition. Her daughter has died. Joining us now is NBC News correspondent Dana Griffith. Dana, these 2 shootings were on the same street today. What do we know about how everyone's doing?
Well, as you mentioned, 3 of the 5 shooting victims have died, Gotti. Now, the first shooting happened this morning. A 20-year-old woman was shot and killed hours later, according to the Orange County Sheriff's Office. A Spectrum News crew, reporter and photographer covering that homicide were also shot. Now, investigators say the gunman then went to a home and shot a mother and her 9-year-old. The reporter and child have both died this afternoon. The child's mother and the news photographer remain in critical condition. Gotti?
Now, the suspect has already been charged with murder in the first shooting. The sheriff just said that he expects more charges for the second shooting. What do we know about who this shooter is?
So investigators have identified him as 19-year-old Keith Melvin Moses. They say he knew the 20-year-old woman killed this morning, but it's unclear why the news crew or the mom and child were targeted. You can see the suspect, his booking photo is currently on your screen. Now, the Orange County Sheriff's Office says that Moses has been detained, and as you mentioned, they expect to charge him with murder, at least with the 20-year-old who was killed this morning and that news reporter. Gotti?
Can you tell us a little bit more about the victims today? What do we know about them?
So the mother and the news photographer are still listed in critical condition. I was actually just listening in to a local reporter outside the hospital. She was emotional, talking about how all of the local media there is coming together to mourn this loss. She mentioned that the reporter has a fiance who showed up to the hospital. And she also mentioned, Gotti, that this is the worst fear for journalists, to be killed while doing their job. So obviously a very emotional scene, you know, when you're in the field, you cover stories with other journalists, regardless if you're from the same station or not. There is this sort of camaraderie. So to know that someone was killed simply doing their job is just heartbreaking. And also a 9-year-old child and a 20-year-old mother among the victims in this series of shootings. Gotti?
Just seems like an unspeakable tragedy on top of an unspeakable tragedy on top of yet another tragedy. Dana, thanks so much.
Yeah.
And President Biden is on his way back to the United States right now after wrapping up that wide-ranging trip to Ukraine and Poland and meeting with the leaders of NATO's eastern flank. Now, geographically, these 9 countries that you see right there, they are incredibly important because they are right on the edge of what's happening between Russia and Ukraine, with President Biden emphasizing to all of them that if anything was to happen to a NATO ally, the United States would be there.
Article 5 is a sacred commitment the United States has made. We will defend literally every inch of NATO, every inch of NATO.
All of this coming as we now learn that just this week, Russia tried testing an intercontinental ballistic missile, which failed right around the time Biden was in Ukraine. And all of that right as Russia said it was stepping away from a treaty that it has with the United States aimed at reducing nuclear firepower. NBC News Chief White House correspondent Kristen Welker joins me now from Warsaw, Poland. Kristen, the last we talked, Russia had said it was backing away from that treaty, but we hadn't heard anything from Biden on that directly. Has that since changed?
It has changed, Gotti. The president with a very forceful response today, calling it a big mistake. And I can tell you, I've been speaking to administration officials who are trying to put this into some context. They say, look, they were not altogether surprised because Russia has really stopped complying with the terms of that treaty. Having said that, there are deep concerns. What will it mean for inspections? What will it mean for their direct lines of communication with Russia around this issue? So those are among the key concerns. And it just underscores the incredibly tense backdrop here. And it really speaks to the message that President Biden has had throughout this trip, both with his surprise trip to Ukraine and then, of course, his speech here in Warsaw, those critical diplomatic talks that you mentioned today. The president has sent the message that it is critical. It is critical that the global community, that NATO allies remained unified to support Ukraine and to try to isolate Russia, Gotti.
And Kristen, back here at home, we've seen some support for Ukraine dropping in the United States as the conflict goes on. Do you think that this trip could change that?
That's certainly the president's hope. That's the White House's hope. That is part of why he made that speech in Warsaw yesterday. He made the case and tried to make the argument that, look, this is bigger than Ukraine. This is a fight for democracy itself. But you're absolutely right. Support back at home among Americans is dropping. And if you look at the polls, 50% of Americans say they disapprove of President Biden's handling of the Ukrainian war. I asked a top official why they think that is. No response, but they say the bottom line is he's going to continue to make this case that it is in everyone's interest to support Ukraine in this conflict and to try to bring this conflict to an end. Gotti.
Kristen Welker, thanks so much.
Thanks, Gotti.
The person accused of carrying out a deadly mass shooting at an LGBTQ club in Colorado last year made a court appearance today. It's the first day of the preliminary hearing for suspect Anderson Aldrich. Aldrich stands accused of killing 5 and injuring 19 others when they allegedly opened fire at Club Q last November, and they face more than 300 criminal charges. NBC's Maura Barrett joins us now. Maura, the court has a rule that we can't rebroadcast any of the footage that was played in court today, but what was shown, what did we learn?
Well, Gotti, a lot of jarring developments. People in the courtroom audibly groaning, some crying as they saw the images of the aftermath of the mass shooting that were shown in court today. Shell casings littered around the bodies of the victims, and police identified parts of firearms the suspect used that were left behind in the club, noting there were not any serial numbers visible, and they appeared to be home assembled. And police also detailed that the suspect wore a ballistic vest with AR-style magazines on their person when they entered the club. Now, we heard testimony from police who responded to the shooting, along with detectives who were investigating the case. We learned more about the suspect's activity prior to the shooting. It turns out that Aldrich had visited the club at least 6 times prior to the shooting, according to ID scanner data. And they also apparently created a website where admins say they often used racist and homophobic slurs. They were also present on the app Discord, where they sent a photo of a rifle scope overlaid on top of an image of a gay pride parade. Now, these developments on top of physical discoveries in the suspect's apartment, where rainbow shooting targets, gun parts, and a rough sketch of Club Q were found. Gotti.
Now, Aldrich's lawyers, they're arguing that their client is non-binary, right? How does that affect these charges?
Well, that was kind of a surprise twist that came out in the affidavit just days after the shooting. Now, of the 300-plus charges the suspect faces, several of them surround bias-motivated crimes or hate crimes. So that's what the prosecution will be seeking to prove, that Aldrich had a bias against the LGBTQ community. With the revelation that Aldrich is non-binary and uses they-them pronouns, that could make the hate crime charge harder to prove. That said, I was on the ground in Colorado in November when the shooting occurred, and those in the community who I spoke to who said that they knew Aldrich said in their interactions with them, they never expressed their pronoun preferences prior to the shooting, not until the interviews with detectives after the shooting. So there will still be a lot of confusion to work out in the trial if the judge decides to move forward with these hate crime charges. Gotti.
Maura Barrett, thanks so much. And still to come, an update on the train derailment. Not only are the people in East Palestine, Ohio, afraid to drink from the tap, but they're worried about showering, too. All while Aaron Brockovich and former President Trump are visiting the small town to see firsthand what's going on.
Where we saw the toxic plume go up into the sky, it was scary. It was the scariest thing I've seen personally as a grown man since 9/11, and I was very upset.
In East Palestine, Ohio, where that train derailed, causing a toxic disaster, a free clinic that was set up to address medical concerns is now fully booked, even though it only opened yesterday. People there are still reporting symptoms like headaches and nausea, while some say they're afraid to take a shower or eat food that's been sitting out of fear of contamination. Meanwhile, former President Trump made a trip to East Palestine, paid for by his political campaign, with thousands of Trump-brand water bottles to give out as well.
We're bringing thousands of bottles of water, Trump water, actually, most of it. Some of it we had to go to a much lesser quality water. You want to get those Trump bottles, I think, more than anybody else. But we're bringing a lot of water, thousands of bottles, and we have it in trucks, and we brought some on my plane today.
Now, the former president said his organization got the water from different Trump hotels, but he's not the only one expected to visit. Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg is scheduled to make his first trip to East Palestine tomorrow. NBC News correspondent Ron Allen joins us now. Ron, can you talk to us about the former president's trip? What was the vibe like today when he was there?
Felt like a campaign stop. It felt like the old days of President Trump, candidate Trump, and he is a candidate again, out on the campaign trail. We were out here in the streets. There are a lot of people. This is a county that President Trump won, was 70% of the vote back in 2020. So he's very popular here. And people were saying that they were glad to see him. They feel like Washington has let them down. And one man said to me, a real leader is here finally. And that was the vibe. It was like a campaign rally.
When that person said a real leader was there, is that out of the norm, or is that kind of the sense that you're getting from a lot of the people that you're talking to?
Again, that was the crowd who came here. That was the crowd who came here to see President Trump. It's a big deal when someone like that comes to a small little town like this of some 4,000 people. Generally speaking, people have been somewhat critical of the federal response here. People have been critical of President Biden. They're glad to see Secretary Buttigieg coming tomorrow, but many people are saying it's too late. Take a listen to what one resident said who was waiting here in the crowd to see President Trump.
I'm disappointed in our federal government, big time. They really could have come through and helped us out a lot better, but they just, the feeling that I get is they just don't care about us.
So there's been this political undercurrent in the background since this happened between Washington and what is clearly a Republican area. Interestingly, yesterday at the press conference, however, Governor DeWine of Ohio, who's a Republican, and Governor Shapiro of Pennsylvania, who's a Democrat, made a point of saying that they are working together every day and that this is not about partisanship. It's about getting things done. And they said this should be a model throughout the rest of the country. But we're in Ohio and Pennsylvania, two big electoral states, and that's what we got today with President Trump.
At the center of all this is still the railroad company, right? How much financial responsibility are they taking so far in this mess? And have they spoken to the people of East Palestine? We've seen so many of those town halls, and yet we haven't seen a town hall that I can think of where the railroad was answering questions directly.
The last big town hall, the railroad sent out a message saying that they weren't going to go because they were fearful for their employees' safety. We don't see them around town. No, there is a family assistance center where there are some railroad employees who are trying to help the community, but we're not permitted to see them. So they're in the background. They've been releasing a lot of paper statements and online statements, which basically say everything reassuring that you would think they could say, that they have given the community in assistance and in commitments more than $6.5 million as of yesterday, that they have bought the fire department here new equipment because so much of their equipment was damaged or destroyed fighting the fire when it happened here 2 Friday nights ago. They say that they'll be here to the end, that they're going to do this cleanup, that they're not leaving town. They say all those things. But interestingly, one of the provisions of the order that the EPA handed down yesterday is that they have to attend public sessions, that they have to be in front of the public. And there's a reason for that, because there's a perception that they haven't been. The CEO, Alan Shaw, has done a couple of interviews lately, but they say they're doing everything they possibly can. But if that were the case, the EPA wouldn't have essentially taken over this operation yesterday and is going to control it moving forward and threatening them with big, heavy fines. And in the case of the states, possible criminal action if they don't clean up the mess here. Daddy?
And it seems like the thing that's resonating the most is to see somebody literally on the ground there in Palestine. Ron Allen, thanks so much. And let's turn now to the special grand jury investigation into Donald Trump's alleged election interference down in Georgia. And one of the things that seems to be dominating headlines are clips from interviews with the forewoman of the jury, Emily Kors, being clipped and posted all over social media.
My coolest moment was shaking Rudy Giuliani's hand. That was really cool for me.
What would your reaction be if the DA decides against bringing any charges after what you've seen?
I will be sad if nothing happens. Like that's about my only request there is for something to happen. I kind of wanted to subpoena the former president because I got to swear everybody in. And so I thought it'd be really cool to get 60 seconds with President Trump.
Keep in mind, this is a very high-profile case. We rarely see interviews like this, and this is also super important to note that a special grand jury does not have the power to issue indictments. They can only recommend them. And Kors says that the jury did recommend indictments for more than a dozen people. She wouldn't say who, but she did chat extensively with our own Blaine Alexander, who joins us now with more. Hey, Blaine.
Well, Gotti, there are a number of things that stand out in this conversation. This was a wide-ranging interview, about 45 minutes or so. One of the things that I noticed immediately was that she was very much walking a line. Of course, she wanted to speak. She wanted to talk about this and give some information, but she was also trying to be very respectful of the judge's orders that all deliberations must remain under wraps. So what you saw was her kind of trying to choose her words carefully, at some points stepping away from answers, essentially saying that gets into deliberations. I'm not going to divulge that or get into that. But when it comes to the recommendations for indictments, that was something that I asked her about extensively. She would not share names. She wouldn't give specific names, but she did characterize the types of people that perhaps are recommended for indictments. Here's a little bit of what she had to say. I also asked her whether she was concerned about potential threats for speaking out. Here's a little bit of that interview. Take a look.
But there definitely are some names that you expect.
Did the grand jury recommend an indictment of former President Trump?
I'm not going to speak on exact indictments.
This is something that, you know, a lot of people have attacked this process that you spent 7 months being part of. Are you concerned that by speaking out about this, even now, you'll receive some blowback or some threats for that?
I would rather be in control of the information stream when it comes to, like, me and this grand jury and our decisions. I'd rather have a hand in that information stream, because it's gonna go somewhere anyway. And I would rather be a part of it going somewhere than sit by and watch people talk about me.
Now, Gotti, that was just a snippet of our conversation. You know, while we talked, she also made it clear that she felt a very strong sense of duty. She took what she was doing seriously, in the sense that she talked about it as being kind of remarkable that citizens like herself and her fellow special grand jurors were involved in this process, that this process could not happen unless they were involved. For the DA's part, we've reached out to the district attorney's office to see if they had any comments on the 4 persons speaking out, and a spokesperson tells me they are declining to comment at this time. Gotti.
Blaine Alexander asking the question so many of us have tonight. After the break, could we see Alec Murdaugh himself take the stand during his own murder trial? What the defense team is saying about the potential move. Plus, before we go, you gotta see this. Remember those Kool-Aid commercials when the Kool-Aid man broke through the walls? Yeah, those ones right there. Well, it's 2023 now, so of course it's turned into a TikTok challenge. Take a look at these teens in New York breaking through a fence. Oh, yeah. Oh, no. Police arrested the 6 guys a little after that on criminal mischief charges. Luckily, no one was hurt. We're going to be right back. And it's time now for some of the big headlines we're watching tonight. The Pentagon just released a new Chinese balloon photo before it was shot down. The picture was captured by a U-2 pilot flying above that white orb. It comes more than 2 weeks after that balloon made headlines as it flew over the United States. And this is a fire at a federal uranium processing facility in Tennessee that happened this morning. Over 200 employees were evacuated. Responders say the fire was contained and there were no reports of injury or contamination. The man convicted of gunning down rapper Nipsey Hussle has been sentenced to 60 years to life in prison. That sentence was handed down today after the shooter Eric Holder was convicted of first-degree murder last year for the 2019 fatal shooting of the LA rapper. He was also found guilty of 2 counts of attempted voluntary manslaughter after 2 others were hurt in that same shooting. In New York City, a woman has been arrested and charged with several hate crimes after video appeared to show her lighting a pride flag on fire. Surveillance footage shows her getting out of her car, walking up to a Manhattan restaurant and setting the flag on fire with what looks like a cigarette lighter. Police say no one was hurt. And how do you take your coffee? You know, almond, milk, half and half, but what about a little spoonful of oil? Well, Starbucks is starting a new line of olive oil infused coffee drinks. It's first going to debut today in Italy, and it will come to the U.S. this spring, starting in California. You guessed it, the place where we love our avocado toast. Well, oil infused coffee's coming next. And now to South Carolina, where we may see and hear from Alec Murdaugh himself. The defense team tells NBC News they are now considering calling him to the stand tomorrow, and this could be a huge and potentially very risky move by the defense. Today, we heard from more character witnesses who at times put Murdaugh's credibility into question. Here's some of what his law partner, Mark Ball, had to say.
He was pretty good at hiding who he really was, wasn't he?
Obviously.
Effortlessly and easily lied to you for years, and you didn't know it.
Didn't know it.
Correct?
Didn't know it and didn't catch it.
And joining me now for some more on this is NBC News correspondent Ellison Barber. Ellison, let's start with the possibility of Alec taking the stand tomorrow. We're talking about a highly trained lawyer here, right? As the defendant, what can we expect and what might prosecutors get in a cross-examination?
Yeah, so it'll be really interesting to see whether or not this actually happens. And in terms of what we could hear from prosecutors or even the defense, if he were to take the stand, it really seems like it's something that could take days, honestly, when you look at how complex this case has been, particularly from the state side. Remember, the prosecution, their key argument here is they say Alec Murdaugh had been stealing millions of dollars for years from his law firm, his legal clients, that trail of lies, if you will, that was starting to unravel. They say that his law firm had started to notice money was missing. They were asking questions. They were opening up an investigation. And the prosecution claims Alec Murdaugh felt like his whole world was crumbling. So in order to try and buy time to cover his tracks, they say he made the decision to kill his wife and son. Now, their case has really centered on a lot of circumstantial evidence. Investigators never found the alleged murder weapons here. Allegedly, there were two. They were never recovered. What they focused a lot on are a number of different narratives and layers. A big thing establishing his alleged financial wrongdoings. They've focused on various Snapchat videos his now deceased son took the night that he was murdered. They've also focused on a lot of cell phone data. All of it has been fairly confusing because there are so many layers, so many different narratives here. You think all of that will be at play and that if he does take the stand, there are a lot of things the prosecution will want to ask him about in cross. That being said, Gotti, the defense, they have been adamant from the beginning saying that their client did not do this. They say he was a loyal, loving family man. And they claim that police, investigators, the prosecution, all of them very quickly zeroed in on their client instead of looking elsewhere. He has maintained his innocence throughout all of this. But if he were to take the stand, you can bet there are going to be a whole lot of questions about the timeline the state has tried to establish of that night and a lot of inconsistencies between what Alec Murdaugh had told investigators about his whereabouts that night. I will say, and I know I'm rambling, but that is just how complicated this case is, right? One of the things we heard this morning before the jury even came into the courtroom was the defense telling the judge that they were still weighing the idea of having their client take the stand. But they asked for something that seemed to surprise the judge. They said, if he is going to take the stand, could we get an order saying that the state will not ask him about his alleged financial crimes? Remember, he is facing charges related to that separately. The judge said, hey, that is unheard of, having a blanket order on questions. It's already been brought in. Then they said, well, if he takes the stand and he's asked about that, can he plead the fifth? The judge said we would have to cross that bridge when we got to it. So there's so much to watch, Gotti, and so many things that could happen tomorrow.
Plead the fifth on another potential case. Ellison, fascinating. Thanks so much.
You bet.
And the U.S. could hit its debt ceiling as soon as this summer. Now, this might be something that you've heard for weeks now, but what does it actually mean for you and your family? Well, before we even get into that, you should know that as the U.S. debt climbs past $31.5 trillion, there isn't even a consensus around when we might go into default. Joining us now is Carlton English. He's a reporter for the Wall Street Journal. She's a reporter for the Wall Street Journal. So real quick, Carlton, there's a new congressional report saying that the country could hit the debt ceiling between July and September. The Treasury Department says June 5th. So when is it coming up?
Yes. So quick correction, Barron's reporter. But, there isn't a lot of consensus on exactly when this will happen. Again, as you point out, this very wide range on dates from late summer to potentially even early fall. The reason behind that is because the government is taking what it calls extraordinary measures to prevent us from going into default. Those extraordinary measures, they include moving assets around various government agencies that have cash available. bill. It includes suspending payments on certain government workers' savings plans. To kind of put it in a picture that most of us could visualize, picture the household that's struggling with their bills. You might take money from your grocery budget to pay your rent. You might say, you know what, my cable bill can slide for a month. I'll pay that later so that I can pay my electric bill, that sort of thing. On a much $31.5 trillion scale, that is what the U.S. government is doing now to try to avoid default.
I love your analogy. And to take it a little bit further, when you're in debt, it means that you owe somebody money. In this case, who is it for the U.S.? Is there a debt collector calling? Like if we're late on our mortgage or credit card, something happens. What happens in this case?
Yes, so there's a number of holders of U.S. debt. One, in some ways, the U.S. government is indebted to itself to the tune of about $5 trillion. About a quarter of U.S. debt is held by foreign holders because foreign countries, they believe in the safety of U.S. credit. That is kind of being raised a little bit skeptically now as we approach this limit. And also just households are holders of U.S. debt or regular investors. I mean, think about the financing that goes into infrastructure, bridges, and things like that. Corporations and other individuals are holders of that debt.
And technically, we did not take out these loans, or we did not borrow them, right? That was Congress borrowing in our name. But what are we at home on the hook for? How does this affect us?
Yeah, so how it affects us, first, right now it's tax season, obviously, so our ability to pay back those debts is based off of how much the government collects as we all pay our taxes. Also, as the U.S. nears its kind of X date when some of these debts will become due, if the U.S. does not come to some sort of agreement, or I should say if Congress does not come to some sort of agreement on raising the debt ceiling, we can see market volatility. Market volatility spills over into economic downturns, a potential recession. So you can see how if the U.S. is not able to fulfill its financial obligations, that can spell trouble for households in terms of employment, job creation, and lots of things like that.
I can't thank you enough. I've been pretending to understand all of this until just now. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much.
All right, for this next story, I don't even know where to start. Sometimes you just come across a video clip that you have to watch a couple of times to see if you heard it right. Well, this one comes from Alaska, where some lawmakers were having a discussion on deadly child abuse when one lawmaker asks a question that seems to stop everyone in their tracks. The video isn't great. It's from a government camera, but the audio, listen for yourself and see what you think.
How would you respond to the argument that I've heard on occasion where, in the case where child abuse is fatal, obviously it's not good for the child, but it's actually a benefit to society because there aren't needed for government services and whatnot over the whole course of that child's life?
Through the chair, can you say that again? Did you say a benefit for society?
Talking dollars. Now, you've got a $1.5 million price tag here for victims of fatal child abuse. It gets argued periodically that it's actually a cost savings because that child is not going to need any of those government services that they might otherwise be entitled to receive and need based on, growing up in this type of environment.
Through the chair, Representative, I guess that would be the idea, if I can use a really bad analogy, when you hit somebody, always back up because it's cheaper to insurance. I don't pertain to that, and I'm really I'm not even sure how to answer that there's a cost saving to the death of a child. The impact that has on a family and us as a society when a child is lost, especially to child abuse and neglect, is unmeasurable.
Now, in a follow-up comment to the Anchorage Daily News, that lawmaker, David Eastman, said that he was pleased the group was against child abuse, but that, quote, a child's value comes not from future productivity, but from the fact that every child is made in the image of God. According to local reports, in 2017, he was also censured for saying women in rural villages try to get pregnant so that they can get free trips to the city for abortions. After the break, a 4-day work week sounds like a dream, right? Well, for many, it's a reality. Could your company be next to make the change? Now Tonight continues. A 4-day work week, something a lot of us have been dreaming about forever. That would make tomorrow Friday. But is it a fantasy, or could it become the next workplace trend? Well, according to a recent pilot program in the UK, it could actually work. Nearly 3,000 employees took part in this pilot, and they overwhelmingly say they are not going back to the Monday to Friday grind. NBC's Tom Costello reports.
Put away the laptops and the hard hats. The American workweek may be headed for the most profound change in nearly 100 years, with more companies shifting from a 5-day week to 4.
It's been life-changing. Really, it's been a wonderful experience.
Crowdfunding platform Kickstarter went from 5 to 4 days last year, hoping to offer a better work-life balance and retain valuable employees. Surprise! The company says productivity increased, employees better rested and more engaged.
People are able to spend time with their families and spend time doing things they love, and they're happier at work and better at work as a result.
Similar findings from a large study involving 61 British companies that went to 4-day, 32-hour weeks last year. 92% say they're sticking with 4 days. 71% reported employees were less stressed and burned out, most saying they're better able to balance home and family commitments, while company revenues actually increased by 35% on average. Researchers say the flex hours that came with the pandemic accelerated the paradigm shift, with many employees, not just white-collar workers, getting more free time. And now, 15% say no amount of money will convince them to go back to 5 days.
In the United States, we got a 5-day work week in the 1930s, and the pandemic really accelerated the thinking. It sort of opened employers' eyes to the idea that they could put in an innovation like this.
So far, larger companies have been slow to embrace the change, some concerned that customer service will suffer. Because once you go to 4 days, it's hard to ask employees to work 5. Tom Costello, NBC News, Washington.
Tom, thanks so much for that report. And while the 4-day work week might help with burnout, there are still some massive holes in the labor market. And one idea to address some of that is to skip on the college route and go old school, as in having a mentor and an apprentice, like in the olden days, but with a futuristic twist. There are programs growing right now in popularity across corporate America, with the labor secretary even saying that they think that this is crucial to the future of work here in the United States. And joining us now is Ewan Blair. He's the CEO and founder of Multiverse, a tech startup that creates debt-free apprenticeship programs here in the United States and the UK. Ewan, thanks so much for joining us today. I think a lot of people listening are very curious to know, how do apprenticeships work in the U.S., and do you need hard skills in a specific field to apply?
It's a great question. They're actually really simple. Look, an apprenticeship is work and training combined. So you don't pay. The costs are fully borne by the employer. They last typically a minimum of 12 months. And our apprenticeships are in tech and professional services. So high skill areas like data analytics, software engineering, business operations. And we also provide personalized coaching and access to a really rich community with meetups, socials, sports teams, and societies. And I think the important thing to stress, the growth is really coming in professional apprenticeships. So the kind of companies we work with are people like Google, McKinsey, Verizon, Morgan Stanley. These are incredible places to work who are taking people without college degrees, without debt, into these jobs.
Here's the thing. I got to admit that if I was growing up today, I'd probably want to do coding. I could totally see myself as being one of those students that decides, like, I'm not going to college. I just want to figure things out myself. Whole apprenticeship thing, it sounds great. But if you're some random dude from New Mexico, how do you convince somebody to take a chance on you? With all due respect, you were the former Prime Minister Tony Blair's son. If I went up against you for any job or apprenticeship, I would be nervous as hell. It feels like privilege still plays a huge role, whether you go to school or not.
Well, privilege definitely plays a role. It's a big problem because there's a massive asymmetry of information. If you come from the kind of background where you've had access to lots of opportunities, internships, you have friends or family members who work in an industry, then that gives you a distinct advantage. But actually, employers want to reach different sources of talent. They know they need to better reflect both the societies they operate in and the customers they serve. And they can't do that by simply hiring the same people. And so it's fascinating. Businesses are actually really driving this. If you look at our apprenticeship programs in the US, 80% of the people that we place are people of color. About half of that group are black. 40% come from the most economically underserved communities. And they are working at these elite companies in brilliant jobs, earning a family-sustaining wage. The average wage for our apprentices in the U.S. is $60,000 a year. And remember, that's with no debt. That's with no opportunity cost of not earning while you're learning, because they're getting that salary from day one of the program. The most important stat I can give you is that 93% stay long-term in their job with that employer. So these are gateways to long-term, really successful careers.
You're at the front lines of all of this landscape. As you look at it, where do you see the biggest gaps? If you were in high school right now, where would you focus most of your attention?
Well, it's really actually calling into question, do you need to go to college? Because at a certain point, 75% of high schoolers will go to college. About half of that group will drop out without completing, which is a real problem, especially when you think of the debt that's being accumulated. Half of all people who graduate from college see no income premium from high school 10 years out. That is a massive, massive issue. So really what we're saying is there is a better alternative where you can go and pursue an apprenticeship, you earn while you learn, you get access to coaching, you get access to mentoring. And you mentioned coding before, right? You're learning things like software engineering, data analytics, jobs they can't really teach you how to do in colleges anyway, because the curriculum gets out of date incredibly quickly, and there is a massive difference between learning how to code in a classroom versus actually doing the job practically. The really fascinating thing about all of this is it is being driven by employers. Employers actually don't care what you know, they care what you can do. And so apprenticeships are the best way of demonstrating that in a really, really practical setting.
Very exciting time. You and Blair, thanks so much for making the time tonight, my friend.
Pleasure.
And check this out. These hot dog hands, I don't know if they look familiar, but they could be yours. A look at the props from the movie Everything, Everywhere, All at Once. They are up for auction. And don't worry, it's all good for a good cause. Stay tuned. And I don't have to brag, but my favorite movie of the year, Everything, Everywhere, All at Once, is the only movie that got double-digit Oscar nominations this year, 11 to be exact. And now you can own a memento from the film, and for a good cause, because the company behind the movie is auctioning off a bunch of their iconic props starting tomorrow, from some of the costumes like Jobu's Elvis getup and Evelyn's shirt-vest combo to weird stuff like those googly-eye rocks from the Rockverse, the glasses from the Alphaverse, and yeah, even hot dog fingers are up for grabs. And it's not just the fingers. Those knitted hot dog gloves are also listed, and the one and only Rakakuni can also be yours for a price. And now for our 60 seconds of joy. Let's first imagine that we're driving down the snowy streets of Alaska, and all of a sudden you see this, a very cold-looking porker, and you think, someone get that pig in a blanket? The police were called, owners were tracked down, and this little piggy went all the way home. And if you're wondering what its name is, it's Elvis. Elvis Pigsley. And you want to know what's better than a set of twin elephants? A set of twin elephants seeing their first bubble bath. This all happened at the zoo in Syracuse. Takata is the soapy one you see soaking it all in, while their twin Yod is still a little lukewarm about all those bubbles, holding back a little. And finally, no, this is not a miniature retirement home. This is the 100th day of school for the kids of Move Mountain's kindergarten, which means little white-haired whippersnappers and canes, curlers, perms, and lessons on how to stay young forever. That does it for us. I'm Gotti Schwartz for News Now Tonight. The news continues right now.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.